The Witch's Love Struggle, Part 2, Exiled but Unbroken. Seraphina Willowbrook begins piecing her life back together in Eldergrove, only to uncover a buried past more tangled with her own fate than she ever imagined. A cursed blacksmith, an ancient grimoire, and a spell meant to steal magic rather than suppress it lead her to a shocking truth. Her ancestors fought to stop the very curse that binds Gareth Ironwood. But before she can act, news from the Arcane Studies Institute delivers another betrayal. Her stolen research is now paraded as the Vivienne Method. They tried to erase her. They think she's been silenced. They have no idea what's coming. Chapter 5. Whispers and Bindings. Seraphina adjusted the books on her newly mended shelf, standing back to observe the effect. The cottage was finally starting to look like a home, not just a shelter, but a place that could hold her research, her rituals, her magic. She'd unpacked everything the night before. Her travel bag, small and weathered with time, had been enchanted with a spatial compression spell her mother invented years ago. Lovingly lazy, her mother always said, "Why carry 5 bags when one will do, as long as magic does the heavy lifting?" It was a spell born of convenience and stubbornness, and it had been one of the earliest bits of magic Seraphina ever memorized. Not because it was complex, it wasn't, but because it was her mother's. That simple, clever enchantment sparked something in her, the realization that magic didn't have to be academic or weaponized or hoarded in marble towers. It could be useful, personal. Magic could serve people, but the Institute didn't like that. Her professors had scoffed at her theories. Her peers whispered behind her back, labeling her a wild mage, a reckless theorist. She'd spent years dulling herself down just to be accepted. Not anymore. Now, with sunlight streaming through clean windows and the scent of sage in the air, Seraphina felt like she could breathe again. She was just placing her cauldron near the back hearth. She liked the idea of brewing with the door open in the summer months, when a knock thudded against the front door. It was sharp, purposeful. Seraphina dusted her hands off on her skirts and opened the door. Standing on the threshold was a woman about her age, dressed in a pristine plum-coloured gown, entirely too ornate for country life. Her blonde curls were artfully arranged beneath a wide-brimmed hat, pinned with a jewelled brooch. Her expression was one of immediate disdain, as if the mere act of looking at Seraphina had ruined her week. "Well, you're the witch they dumped out here," Seraphina blinked. "And you are?" The woman didn't answer. She stepped closer, trying to peer past Seraphina into the house. "I'm just here to give you a bit of advice," she said sweetly, though the acid in her tone was unmistakable. "We don't tolerate dark magic in Eldergrove. We're a respectable town." Seraphina couldn't help it. A laugh escaped her lips before she could smother it. "Dark magic?" she echoed. "Good gods, are we still using those terms? Magic is like fire, darling. It isn't dark or light. It just is. What matters is the one casting it." The woman's smile stiffened. "That's exactly the kind of talk I meant. I know your type. I've heard plenty from my contacts at the Institute. Seems you got a little too full of yourself and got burned for it." Seraphina's smile dropped. Her eyes narrowed. Of course. This one had friends in high places, or at least liked to pretend she did. She leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and gave the woman a once-over. "I don't recall inviting you here. And unless you're here on official Institute business or by personal invitation, which you're not, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The woman drew herself up, as if preparing to hurl one more insult, but Seraphina wasn't finished. With a flick of her wrist, she whispered a spell under her breath. A small breeze surged from behind her, stirring the air into a gust that picked up the dust from the front path and sent it spinning directly into the woman's perfectly powdered face. She shrieked, waving her hands in front of her as her hat nearly flew off and her curls frizzed in the dusty wind. "Witch!" she snapped, coughing as she stumbled back. "You'll regret that." Seraphina didn't flinch. "I regret opening the door." The woman glared, eyes watering, and jabbed a finger in her direction. "Just don't try anything stupid. Eldergrove doesn't take kindly to troublemakers." With that, she turned and stormed off, puffing like a disgruntled cat. Only then did Seraphina notice a small crowd gathered just beyond the hedgerow. Townsfolk who had paused their errands or leaned against fences, watching the scene unfold with cold interest. They weren't laughing. They weren't smiling. They whispered behind hands and narrowed their eyes at her, as if she'd already confirmed every warning they'd ever been given. Seraphina's stomach twisted for half a second until it didn't. She straightened her spine, turned on her heel, and shut the door without another word. She was used to being talked about. The Institute had whispered about her for years. If this town wanted to sneer behind fences and shutter their windows as she passed, they were welcome to it. They didn't know it yet, but she wasn't here to fit in. She was here to work. With her irritation simmering, Seraphina turned her focus back to cleaning, and that's when she found the book. It was wedged beneath a crooked floorboard near the hearth, hidden away by some long-forgotten resident. The binding was brittle with age, the cover unmarked. But the moment her fingers brushed it, she felt the pulse of old magic, like the breath of a sleeping beast. She carried it to the kitchen table and carefully opened it, each page crackling faintly. The handwriting inside was faded but legible. Notes, diagrams, runes drawn in black and red ink, formulas written in a precise, meticulous hand. One heading jumped out at her immediately: Theory of Recursive Generational Binding. Her brow furrowed. That was almost exactly the subject of her suspended research. The methods listed weren't identical to hers, but they walked a similar path. There were symbols she didn't recognize, circular ceiling diagrams that curved in on themselves like spirals within spirals. There were no names, no signature. But the margins were filled with shorthand notes, written in the hand of someone who'd clearly been experimenting. Someone brilliant, or reckless, possibly both. Seraphina closed the book slowly, unsettled. Whatever this was, it wasn't common magic. And it wasn't the kind of thing you left lying around unless you wanted someone to find it, or were forced to abandon it in a hurry. She tapped the leather cover thoughtfully, then slipped it into her enchanted bag, now transfigured from a travel satchel to a stylish crossbody that hugged her hip. She wasn't done with this book, not even close. Later that afternoon, she ventured into the heart of Eldergrove with her chin lifted and eyes forward, completely ignoring the wary glances tossed her way. She needed food, supplies, and maybe a few comforts to make the cottage feel less like exile and more like choice. The village wasn't large. One main street split the settlement in half, with shops lining both sides. The grocer, a bakery, a cobbler, and yelling. Seraphina paused, her senses prickling. The voices were raised, angry. A crowd had gathered near the blacksmith's forge, clustered tight near the entrance. Curious despite herself, she turned and made her way closer, keeping to the edge of the crowd. A man stood in the entryway of the smithy, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and quiet as stone. The shouting came from a group of men surrounding him, red-faced and bristling. She didn't know what they were angry about, and frankly she didn't care. But as her eyes passed over the man, something buzzed beneath her skin. Marks. They were faint, but visible. Arcane markings etched into his skin, trailing down his arms and neck in looping ancient scripts. A binding. A strong one. Seraphina's interest sharpened. She didn't sense magic emanating from him, but the markings were clearly active. That was not how it should work. He didn't respond to the insults, just stared the group down with calm, unwavering focus. He didn't need help, which was good. Seraphina wasn't about to play hero to a town that hated her. But as she turned away and stepped into the grocer's shop, her mind was already spinning. The binding was too sophisticated for some petty spell. This was carefully layered work. Possibly old, possibly permanent. She gathered what she needed, paid in silence, and left the grocer with a plan already forming. Back at her cottage, Seraphina lit a candle, pulled out a piece of enchanted parchment, and scrawled a message. To the man bound at the forge, I'm a researcher of complex magic, including binding and curse theory. I believe we may have reason to speak. If you're willing to be studied, I'd offer compensation. I assure you, I'm far less awful than the locals. She signed it with a flourish and a sealing rune, then whispered a tracking charm as she folded it and tapped the top with her finger. The parchment folded in on itself, shaped into a tiny paper hawk, and zipped out the open window. She didn't expect an answer. Bound individuals shouldn't have access to spellcasting, let alone messenger magic. But not 5 minutes later, her window fluttered open again, and the hawk returned, carrying a neatly folded reply in its talons. She unfolded it with careful fingers. Curious? I expected you'd wait longer before poking into my business. Very well. I accept. Come tomorrow evening. Don't knock. Just walk in. It was unsigned. Seraphina stared at the page, heart thudding. How had he sent this back? Bound magic wasn't supposed to allow even simple spellcasting, which meant either the binding wasn't complete, or something far more complicated was at work, and either way, she needed to find out why. Chapter 6. Below the Hearth and Into the Fire. Seraphina had planned to spend the day preparing for her meeting with the blacksmith, but the universe had other ideas. It started when she tried to reorganize the hearth's stonework. There was a draft that never stopped, no matter how many warmth runes she inscribed into the brick. Annoyed, she knelt and reached underneath to see if a vent had been left open, only for her fingers to brush against something metallic. A hollow clink echoed in the silence of the cottage. Seraphina frowned. She pressed her palm flat against the stone floor, whispering a short detection charm. A faint shimmer rippled across the stone, revealing a hidden seam that traced the outline of a trapdoor. Her pulse quickened. She shouldn't have been surprised. The cottage reeked of old magic. Why wouldn't it have a few secrets? Still, finding one so conveniently placed beneath her hearth was either an incredible coincidence or something far more deliberate. She whispered a command, and the rune lock disengaged with a soft pop. A small staircase descended into darkness. No torch, no guide, no wards. Whoever had lived here before either hadn't intended for anyone to find it, or had expected someone like her eventually would. Seraphina summoned a pale sphere of light and carefully made her way down. The air was cooler below, tinged with that earthy metallic scent of long-dormant spellwork. The root cellar was small, maybe 10 feet wide, but carved with overlapping runic sigils from floor to ceiling. Some were familiar, binding glyphs, sealing runes, ritual conduits, but others were foreign, the geometry more complex than anything she'd studied. She reached out and brushed a rune that resembled a spiral folding into itself. A spark snapped beneath her fingertips, and the light pulsed in response to her magic. She drew her hand back slowly. The same resonance. It was the same style of binding she'd seen on the blacksmith. Now she was certain. Her assignment here wasn't exile. It was a burial. They hadn't sent her to rot. They'd sent her here to hide something, or to make sure she'd never uncover what they already knew. Well, that plan had backfired spectacularly. She returned upstairs, set wards over the cellar to keep curious noses out, and started writing notes with renewed energy. Every stroke of the pen fed her excitement. She didn't even realize it was dusk until the candlelight deepened to a soft amber. The hour had come. The forge was warm with firelight, the scent of scorched iron and oil hanging heavy in the air. When she stepped through the open door, the blacksmith was waiting, exactly as promised. He stood near the anvil, his arms crossed, sleeves rolled up to reveal the script coiling down his skin. His shirt clung to him with sweat and soot, but his expression was unreadable, save for the slight tilt of amusement in his brow. "You're punctual," he said, not looking at her. "You gave me a time," she replied. His lips tugged at the corner. People don't always follow through. She stepped further in. "Do you have a name? Or should I keep referring to you as the blacksmith with the alarming tattoos in my notes?" He turned to her fully then, eyes sharp with something between amusement and challenge. "Gareth. Gareth Ironwood." The name landed with a strange sort of gravity. Ironwood. she echoed, arching a brow. Fitting. Did your ancestors know about your trade or curse you into it? I forge steel, not destinies, he replied, then added with a dry smile. But if you're writing a biography, I prefer something with more mystery. Maybe the handsome cursed loner with a grudge. Seraphina blinked, then surprised herself by laughing, just once. Duly noted. She watched him quench the blade in a bucket of water, steam hissing upward. So the question becomes, are the bindings flawed, or are you? That got a laugh out of him, deep, brief, and surprisingly genuine. I like you already, Gareth said. You've got sharp edges. And you're stalling, she said, crossing her arms. I want to know where the binding came from, who cast it, why it's still half active but not limiting your spell work. He raised a brow, set the cooled blade aside, and finally turned to face her fully. I'll answer your questions, eventually. But first, he gestured loosely toward her. You've got something else on your mind. You've got that I found a secret chamber beneath my house look. Her mouth opened slightly in surprise. He smirked. Just a guess. Seraphina narrowed her eyes. Have you been in that cottage before? No, Gareth said, but you're not the first they sent out here. You're just the first in a long time. Her blood chilled. What happened to the last? His smile disappeared. Gone. Vanished. Left one day without a word, no trace. Council said she was unstable. Dangerous. Seraphina's heart skipped. You knew her? He shook his head. No one really did. She didn't talk much to the townsfolk. But her magic left echoes. You can feel them in the trees. He gave her a look. So whatever you're digging up down there, witch, be careful it doesn't dig back. Seraphina ran her tongue along the edge of her teeth, letting the warning settle. Then, casually, Gareth added, By the way, word got out about your dusting spell. Lady Clarissa Wrenmore hasn't stopped whining about the filthy little sorceress who disrespected her beauty routine. Seraphina groaned. Of course her name is Clarissa. She's good at playing polite, but she's got the spine of a weasel, Gareth said. You've already made an enemy in high places. Must be a gift of yours. Seraphina gave him a pointed look. I'd say the same about you, considering the angry mob outside your shop earlier. They don't like things they don't understand, Gareth replied simply. Neither do you, if we're being honest. She couldn't argue that. You said you'd let me study the binding. I said I'd let you look. Study comes after trust. Then let me start earning it. A beat of silence passed between them, something heavy and unspoken in the air. Then, finally, Gareth nodded. 1 hour. No spells. You cross any lines, you're out. Seraphina smiled slowly. Deal. Chapter 7. Echoes in the Skin. Gareth didn't look up when she stepped into the forge the next evening. He was at the workbench, sharpening the edge of a scythe, sparks flicking from the grindstone in sharp rhythm. The forge glowed dimmer today, more embers than flame, and the air carried the familiar scent of scorched iron and wood smoke, but something beneath it all prickled at her senses. Gareth smirked without turning. You're early. She walked past the rack of half-forged tools and stopped near the bench. Early bird catches the worm. He paused, turned, and gestured to a wooden stool beside the anvil. You still want a look? She nodded once. With no further discussion, he peeled off his shirt. The movement was fluid, casual, like it meant nothing, but her breath hitched the moment her eyes traced the markings. Now up close and in firelight, she could see the full extent of the binding. The glyphs wrapped around his torso and shoulders like branded chains, each one meticulously placed. Some of the lines pulsed faintly with residual power, like veins that remembered magic long after it had been bled out. Others shimmered with runic echoes, ghosts of spells long spent. Her fingers hovered just inches above his skin. Don't touch the ones that shimmer blue, he said, voice low. They bite. I'm not an amateur, she murmured, eyes focused. I can tell which ones are reactive. She didn't need to tell him she was also dying to touch them, not out of desire, though he was distractingly well built, but because the spell work was unlike anything she'd ever seen. She brought her own magic to her fingertips, carefully channeling a thread of it into the closest rune. The mark flared, then dimmed. Interesting. She circled behind him, noting that the most complex scripts were along his spine. Some of them overlapped. That was unusual. Binding spells weren't usually layered like that unless... Her eyes narrowed. Whoever cast this, she began, but Gareth cut her off. Didn't know what they were doing? He offered dryly. She shook her head. No, they knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't finish it. That got his attention. He turned, his brows knit. Seraphina reached for her bag and pulled out a sketch of a symbol she'd copied from the cellar beneath her cottage, one that matched a half-buried spiral etched behind his right shoulder. This was carved into the foundation beneath my hearth, she said, holding the page up to the firelight. It's part of a recursive binding loop, but it's incomplete, intentionally interrupted. That's why you still have access to magic. It wasn't just sloppy spell work. She looked up at him, voice steady. Someone interfered with the original design. Gareth stared at the drawing, then at her. You think this was meant to fail? No, she said. I think it was meant to succeed, and someone else stopped it. He frowned, and she saw the weight behind his silence. Not doubt, but something heavier. Old. A truth he'd suspected for years but never had the evidence to voice. Do you know who cast it? She asked. He hesitated. No, only that it started with the fall of our family estate, long before I was born. My mother never talked about it, but she had the same marks. Faded with age. She could do even less magic than me. Seraphina felt something twist in her chest. She stepped closer. Gareth, this wasn't some petty curse. This was a siphon. A binding designed to slowly draw power from your bloodline. It wasn't punishment, it was theft. His jaw clenched. And what? You just happened to be dumped into the one cottage that held the blueprints? No, she whispered. I was put there. Buried under fake reassignment and institute bureaucracy. And you... She looked up into his eyes. You were left alive because they didn't know the spell failed, possibly weakened with time, and the interruption that someone cast on your family. The forge was silent except for the crackle of the coals. Gareth's gaze dropped to the paper in her hands, and then to his own chest. If this was theft, he said, what did they take? Your magic, your legacy, possibly your entire bloodline's potential. She hesitated, then added, but not all of it. Something stopped the full siphon. Some counterforce. A ward strong enough to keep it from fully activating. Gareth's eyes locked on hers. And you think you know what that was? No, she said honestly. Not yet. But she had a theory. Because as she stood there, in the flickering half-light of the forge, her magic buzzed again. Not just near the runes, but with them. She extended her hand, palm out, and let her magic pulse through her fingertips. One of the glyphs near his collarbone shimmered, and responded. Not to Gareth, to her. A blinding flash lit the room, brief but brilliant, and for one breathless second, the marking on Gareth's skin and the sigil from her cottage glowed the same eerie silver violet. When it faded, they both staggered slightly. Gareth blinked. What the hell was that? Seraphina stared down at her palm where the magic still hummed. I think, she said slowly, we just activated something buried a very long time ago. And for the first time in years, she was afraid. Not of the council, not of exile, but of the truth. Chapter 8. What the Magic Remembers. Seraphina hadn't slept. She'd barely moved from her work table since returning from Gareth's forge, papers and parchments scattered around her like snowdrifts. The marking that had pulsed under her hand was burned into her mind, not just visually but viscerally. It had responded to her. And no spell, no curse, no binding should have done that unless the caster and the responder shared something in common, something ancient. She traced the outline of the rune again, muttering old dialects under her breath as she cross-referenced her grimoire, her family's scattered notes, and her own sketches. Everything she found only deepened the unease in her chest. The runes didn't just look familiar, they felt familiar, like muscle memory, like something she'd always known but never understood. Her hand trembled over the final page of the grimoire when her magic flared suddenly, quiet but unmistakable. A tug, a pulse, a presence. The book shifted, not physically but magically. It wanted her attention. Cautiously, Seraphina whispered a few words to let her own magic rise to the surface. Not shaped, not commanded, just felt. The pulse surged again, warm and faintly curious, before nudging her toward the bottom corner of a page she'd passed over before. In the light, it looked blank, but under her focus, faded ink shimmered to life. A single line of spellwork, written in a hand she didn't recognize. The letters looped and dipped, but the cadence, it reminded her of her mother's spell style, or maybe her grandmother's. Ostende quod meminit, she read aloud. Show what remembers. As soon as the final syllable passed her lips, the room began to shift. Not physically, but the light changed, the air thickened, and shadows peeled from the walls like breath-fogging glass. Her candle didn't flicker, and yet the space grew dimmer. Then, a flash, soft and golden. And suddenly she was not in her cottage anymore. She was in the memory of it. The walls were older, untouched by time, glowing faintly with residual spellwork. The air smelled of moss and wax, and voices echoed from the central room. Seraphina stepped forward, cautious. No one looked her way. She was a ghost here. A circle of people sat around the hearth. 4 women, 2 men, all visibly weary, their clothes worn and expressions tense. She noticed the marks on their skin immediately, glyphs of power and protection, and binding. They looked just like Gareth's, only darker, denser, as though they'd borne the full weight of the original curse before it was ever tempered. One woman stood and traced sigils into the air as she spoke. Her voice was distorted by time, but Seraphina recognized some of the words. Dilution, lineage, stability. Another man, broad-shouldered and hawk-eyed, nodded. The grey line seeks to hoard what they could not create. If we do nothing Willowbrook, we lose our future. Willowbrook and Ironwood. Her and Gareth's ancestors. This was the moment it began. The alliance that tried to stop the siphon. Relief flooded her chest. Her family hadn't cast the curse. They'd resisted it. But just as she reached for more, just as she hoped for some crucial detail, the vision began to dissolve. The voices dimmed, the colours bled outward like ink in water. No, wait, she whispered. And then, another vision surged into place. This time, only one woman stood in the cottage. Her shoulders were hunched, her coat dusted with snow and her face pale with despair. Seraphina watched as the woman slowly unpacked her things, much as she herself had done. Time sped unnaturally, days flickering by in seconds. The woman lit the hearth, scrubbed the floors, repaired broken shelves, and as the months passed, she began to change. She studied the grimoire, she traced the same glyphs Seraphina had. She found the hidden cellar. With every discovery, Seraphina felt a sense of kinship. The woman didn't speak, but her thoughts seemed to echo in the air. Why am I here? What were they hiding? What did they do to him? The woman looked familiar. Her jawline, her eyes. Seraphina squinted. Was it a cousin? An aunt? She couldn't quite place it. Time flicked forward again, this time halting in the middle of a stormy evening. The woman stood in the main room speaking to someone, a man. His back was to Seraphina, but his stance, his voice, it was so close to Gareth's it made her chest ache. They argued, not angrily, but emotionally. desperately. And then, the woman opened the grimoire and began to recite something, glyphs forming in the air. The door burst open. A blast of red light, an explosion of sound. Seraphina shielded her eyes instinctively, and the memory shattered. She jolted awake, gasping, her palms flat on the work table. Her candle was half burned, the grimoire closed again. The cottage was still, except for the soft sound of fluttering wings. A parchment bird, a sleek white gull, had glided in through the window and now sat calmly on her bookshelf, its wings folded neatly, a message tucked under one claw. Still shaking, Seraphina reached for it. The bird dissolved into embers as she lifted the scroll. The seal was crimson wax, stamped with the sigil of the Arcane Studies Institute. She unrolled it. Seraphina, I thought you should know. Marcus and Vivienne have announced their new joint research initiative. They've taken your lab, yes, your lab, and have begun reinterpreting your stabilizing glyph theory. They're calling it the Vivienne Method. She wore your necklace at the gala, the one Marcus gave you last year. Thought you'd appreciate the irony. I'm sorry. A friend. Seraphina read it twice, then a third time. The paper crinkled in her fists as her magic sparked involuntarily at her fingertips. A rune lit up on the edge of her desk before she forced herself to breathe. She stared at the flickering candle, her jaw tight. They weren't just discarding her, they were erasing her. But they didn't know what she knew now. They didn't know the story behind her name. And if they wanted to drag her legacy through the dirt, she would rise from the roots beneath their feet. And that, dear readers, brings us to the end of another magical chapter here with the Great Book Witch. If you enjoyed this bookish journey, don't forget to like this video. It helps keep the magic alive. Have thoughts, theories, or book recommendations? Drop them in the comments. I love hearing from fellow book witches. And if you want to keep turning the pages with me, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Until next time, may your bookshelves be full and your TBRs endless. Stay magical, and I'll see you in the next one.